After more than 20 years of watching relationship patterns, I've noticed something repeatedly happen with emotionally avoidant people. They can walk away from relationships that from the outside seem almost impossible to reject. They can distance themselves from partners who are caring, patient, loyal, understanding, and deeply sincere. They may have someone beside them who gives them room to breathe, respects their boundaries, avoids unnecessary pressure, and offers the kind of consistent affection most people desperately want. And yet somehow, the avoidance still pulls away. I have seen people who appeared completely comfortable being alone, suddenly encounter one particular kind of person, and something inside them begins to shift. It does not always result in a perfect relationship. It does not necessarily mean they suddenly become emotionally available, or that everything ends in a happy resolution. But the encounter can reach places in them that ordinary relationships never touched. That is the person I want to talk about. And if you are listening to this because something about the description feels strangely familiar, there is a possibility that you recognize yourself in it. The empath who affects an avoidant most deeply is not necessarily the person who loves them the most intensely. It is not the person who endlessly waits, constantly accommodates, or keeps adjusting their own needs so the avoidant never feels uncomfortable. Those qualities can come from a beautiful heart, but they can also unintentionally activate the very defenses they are trying to soften. Why? Because beneath avoidant behavior, there is often a deep sensitivity to emotional expectation. When someone appears to need them intensely, when another person's emotional stability seems tied to their presence, the connection can begin to feel like an obligation. Even genuine love can be experienced as pressure when it carries an obvious emotional demand. The person who reaches the avoidant on a much deeper level is different. I would describe them as someone with sovereign emotional depth. They feel intensely. They notice subtle changes. They pick up on emotions that other people might completely miss. Their sensitivity is powerful, sometimes almost instinctive, but they are not ruled by that sensitivity. They have spent enough time confronting themselves to know that feeling something deeply does not mean they must immediately act on it. They have experienced disappointment, loneliness, uncertainty, and their own inner darkness. They have learned how to sit with difficult emotions without allowing those emotions to control their decisions. Their sensitivity has become strength rather than fragility. This person can love the avoidant deeply without making the avoidant responsible for their emotional survival. They may want them enormously. They may care about them more than they can easily explain. They may feel the connection in a profound way. But their sense of stability does not depend on whether the avoidant chooses to come closer today. And that combination is extremely powerful, because the avoidant's usual withdrawal pattern is designed to respond to emotional pressure. Someone moves closer. The avoidant feels the weight of expectation. They retreat. The other person becomes anxious and reaches harder. The avoidant creates even more distance. Eventually, both people become trapped inside the same exhausting cycle. But the deeply grounded empath responds differently. When the avoidant retreats, they do not immediately chase. That does not mean they are unaffected. In fact, they may feel the distance more intensely than almost anyone else. The difference is what they do with that feeling. Instead of moving outward in search of reassurance, they move inward. They reconnect with themselves. They regulate their emotions. They return to the parts of their life that existed before the relationship. They remind themselves that another person's temporary unavailability does not determine their value. They do not abandon themselves simply because someone else has stepped back. And this is where the avoidance familiar system can become confused. The retreat happens, but there is no desperate pursuit afterward. There is no emotional bargaining, no dramatic attempt to force closeness, no desperate demand for an explanation. There is simply stillness. The avoidance suddenly has nothing to push against. There is no obvious emotional dependence confirming their belief that closeness will eventually become overwhelming. There is no desperate reaching that allows them to feel safely detached and in control. Instead, there is a person who remains emotionally alive while remaining firmly rooted in themselves. That kind of calm can be deeply unsettling and strangely attractive because the avoidant may be accustomed to relationships where they are either placed on a pedestal or eventually blamed and resented for failing to live up to that image. The grounded empath does neither. They see the person underneath the behavior. They notice the contradictions. They recognize the moments of genuine tenderness, but they also recognize the distancing, deflection, inconsistency, and emotional unavailability. They do not pretend the difficult parts aren't there, but they also do not turn those difficult parts into a reason to hate or punish the person. They see clearly, and they remain compassionate. That combination is rare. To be understood without being idealized is unusual. To be seen accurately without immediately being judged is even rarer. And for someone who has spent much of their life protecting themselves through emotional distance, being genuinely seen by another person can be profoundly disorienting, because suddenly, the usual defenses lose some of their purpose. The walls were built to protect against people who would demand too much, misunderstand them, become emotionally dependent, or eventually become angry when their needs were not met. But what happens when someone sees the wall completely and does not attack it? What happens when someone recognizes the fear behind the distance, understands the limitation without romanticizing it, and still responds with calmness rather than punishment? That is where something begins to change. The empath is no longer trying to break through the wall. They are simply refusing to become trapped behind it. And that distinction matters more than most people realize. There is another quality that makes this kind of empath so different, and it may be the one that reaches the avoidant more deeply than anything else. They do not make it their mission to repair the avoidant. That sounds obvious until you really examine what happens in many relationships involving emotional distance. A person may say, "I accept you exactly as you are," while secretly hoping that their patience will eventually produce a different version of that person. They give space, but they are counting the days until the avoidant comes back. They remain understanding, but underneath that understanding is a quiet expectation that eventually the avoidant will recognize their love and finally become emotionally available. They tolerate distance because they believe the distance is temporary. They are patient because they are waiting for a reward. And even when none of this is spoken aloud, the emotional expectation can still be felt. The avoidant may not be able to explain what feels wrong, but something inside them detects it. They sense that the acceptance has conditions. They understand, consciously or unconsciously, that there is an invisible agreement. I will accept your distance for now, but eventually you need to change. And that can make acceptance feel like another form of pressure. The sovereign empath operates differently. They are not secretly trying to unlock the avoidant. They are not studying every behavior to discover the perfect technique that will make them open up. They are not thinking, if I say this correctly, give them enough space, wait long enough and remain patient enough, eventually they will become the partner I know they can be. They understand something much harder. You cannot emotionally transform another person for them. You cannot love someone into doing their inner work. You cannot become so perfect that another person's fear disappears. And you cannot carry the responsibility for another person's emotional development. So instead of trying to change the avoidant, this empath simply sees them, not the fantasy version, not the potential version, not the version they imagine will emerge someday after every wound has been healed. They see the person standing in front of them. They notice what is real instead of becoming consumed by what might be possible, and that changes the entire dynamic. Stay with me here, because this is where the deeper truth begins to reveal itself. The empath's strength is not that they can finally make the avoidant feel safe. Their strength is that they can remain connected to themselves, even when the other person cannot remain connected to them. That difference may look small from the outside, but emotionally, it is enormous. They can offer warmth without chasing. They can offer understanding without excusing everything. They can care without becoming responsible. They can leave the door open without standing beside that door forever. And this creates something the avoidant may rarely experience: closeness without captivity. The connection does not feel like a cage because the empath is not trying to possess them. It does not feel like abandonment either because the empath is not using distance as punishment. There is simply freedom on both sides. The avoidant can move closer by choice rather than pressure, and the empath can remain grounded whether that choice happens or not. That is why this person can stay in the avoidant's mind long after the interaction ends, not because they played games, not because they disappeared to create obsession, not because they manipulated the other person's fears. They remain memorable because they offered something emotionally unusual. They were close without becoming consuming. They were sensitive without becoming unstable. They understood without demanding access to every hidden part of the other person. And perhaps most importantly, they did not lose themselves while loving someone who struggled with closeness. That can create a powerful internal contrast. The avoidant may begin comparing this connection with previous experiences. They may remember how easy it felt to breathe around this person. They may remember moments when they expected criticism but received calmness. They may remember moments when they expected pressure but were given space. And then, sometimes quietly, they begin wondering why they pulled away from someone who never tried to control them. That question can stay with them. But there is something equally important to understand. Being this kind of empath does not mean waiting indefinitely for an avoidant to return. It does not mean tolerating disrespect because you understand where the behavior comes from. It does not mean accepting inconsistency, disappearing acts, emotional neglect, or repeated rejection simply because you recognize the fear underneath them. Compassion without boundaries becomes self-abandonment. Understanding without standards becomes permission. The grounded empath knows this. They can hold compassion and boundaries at the same time. They can say, "I understand why you withdraw, but I will not build my life around your withdrawal. I understand that closeness scares you, but I will not make myself smaller so you can remain comfortable. I care about what happened to you, but I also care about what is happening to me." That is emotional sovereignty. And ironically, this may be one of the strongest forms of love available. Not the love that says, "I will stay no matter what you do," but the love that says, "I care deeply, and I still refuse to abandon myself." If the avoidant eventually becomes capable of meeting that level of honesty, something meaningful can grow. If they do not, the empath still walks away with their identity intact, and that is the part people often miss. The goal was never to become the one person who could finally fix them. The goal was to become someone who could love deeply without disappearing inside another person's fear. Once you understand that, the entire relationship looks different. You stop asking, "How can I make them choose me?" and begin asking, "Does this connection allow both of us to become more fully ourselves?" That question changes everything. And if you needed to hear this today, remember one thing. The person who affects an avoidant most deeply is often not the person who chases hardest. It is the person who can love sincerely, see clearly, remain compassionate, and still choose themselves. They see the person who exists right now. If that person is kind today and removed tomorrow, they observe both. If they can connect deeply but struggle to maintain emotional consistency, they recognize that too. If there are moments where the avoidance seems completely present and then suddenly becomes unreachable, the empath does not pretend otherwise. But they also do not turn every retreat into a personal insult. Their clarity allows them to hold two truths at once. This person may sincerely care about me, and this person may still be incapable of giving me the relationship I need. Those statements can exist together. That is emotional clarity, and it is precisely what makes this person so difficult for the avoidant to categorize. The avoidant cannot easily place them into the familiar roles. They are not the desperate pursuer. They are not the angry critic. They are not the person who blindly idealizes them. They are not someone waiting around to prove their worth. And they are certainly not someone who needs to destroy the avoidant simply because the avoidant could not give them what they wanted. Instead, they remain centered. They can say, "I understand why you are pulling away," without saying, "Therefore I must accept anything you do." They can have compassion without abandoning boundaries. They can love someone without losing themselves inside that love. And that is an extremely forceful combination, because the avoidant often expects emotional closeness to come with a price. They may unconsciously associate intimacy with responsibility, expectation, loss of freedom, or eventual disappointment. But this person introduces something unfamiliar: connection without possession, love without emotional captivity, closeness without the demand to surrender one's entire identity. The empath is saying through their behavior, rather than through endless explanations, I can care about you deeply without controlling you. I can miss you without chasing you. I can understand your fear without making your fear my responsibility. I can want you without needing you to complete me. That kind of emotional independence changes the atmosphere of the relationship. Suddenly, the avoidant is no longer dealing with someone who is trying to pull them across an emotional finish line. There is no constant pressure to perform intimacy. There is no demand to prove their feelings every few hours. There is no expectation that every uncomfortable emotion must immediately be resolved. And because the pressure is gone, something unexpected can happen. The avoidant may begin to notice their own feelings. When another person stops doing all the emotional reaching, the avoidant has fewer distractions from what is happening inside themselves. They may begin to feel the absence. They may wonder why the other person is no longer pursuing them. They may notice that the silence feels different this time. Not hostile, not manipulative, not designed to punish. Just still. And that silence can become a mirror. For perhaps the first time, the avoidant has to encounter a question they could previously avoid. What do I actually feel when this person is no longer standing outside my walls trying to get in? That question can be uncomfortable because distance once gave them control. But when the other person is capable of walking away without hatred, without revenge, and without collapsing, the meaning of that distance changes. The avoidant can no longer assume that the other person will remain indefinitely available. And yet this empath does not use that realization as a weapon. They are not creating scarcity to manipulate desire. They are not pretending not to care. They are simply living honestly. If the relationship is healthy and mutual, they are open to it. If the other person needs space, they respect it. If the connection becomes consistently painful or one-sided, they are capable of stepping back. That is not a strategy, it is self-respect. And this is exactly why their presence can leave such a lasting impression. The avoidant is accustomed to people reacting to their distance. This person responds to distance by returning to themselves. The avoidant expects withdrawal to create pursuit. Instead, it creates reflection. They expect someone to fight for access to them. Instead, they encounter someone who knows they are valuable even without access. And somewhere beneath all the defenses, that can awaken something the avoidant has spent years suppressing. The realization that intimacy does not necessarily mean losing freedom, that love does not automatically mean being controlled, that another person's emotional depth does not have to become a burden, and perhaps most importantly, that being truly seen does not always end in rejection. Sometimes, someone can see the whole person, the strengths, fears, contradictions, and limitations, and still remain compassionate. That experience can become impossible to forget. Something even deeper begins to happen when an avoidant encounters a person who possesses this kind of emotional independence. The connection stops being simply about the relationship. It starts confronting the avoidant with themselves. That is what makes the experience so powerful. Most relationships give us opportunities to maintain our familiar identities. We can become the giver, the caretaker, the independent one, the wounded one, the person who always needs reassurance, or the person who never seems to need anyone. But the sovereign empath does not easily allow the avoidant to remain inside that familiar role. They do not chase them enough to make withdrawal feel safe. They do not attack them enough to justify the withdrawal, and they do not idealize them enough to allow them to hide behind an image of perfection. Instead, they quietly reflect reality. If the avoidant is caring, they see it. If the avoidant is frightened, they see that too. If the avoidant creates distance because intimacy becomes uncomfortable, they recognize the pattern without turning it into a dramatic accusation. That level of perception can feel almost unsettling to someone who has spent years relying on emotional distance, because there is nowhere obvious to hide. The empath is not trying to expose them. They are simply not willing to lie to themselves about what they see. And this is where the avoidant may begin experiencing an internal contradiction. One part of them may want the connection, another part may immediately want to escape it. One part may feel safe with this person because there is no emotional pressure. Another part may become frightened precisely because the connection feels safe enough to matter. That distinction is important. Sometimes people assume avoidant behavior means there are no feelings underneath it, but withdrawal and lack of feeling are not always the same thing. A person can care deeply and still struggle to tolerate the vulnerability that comes with caring. In fact, sometimes, the stronger the emotional significance becomes, the more intensely the defensive system activates. That is why the centered empath can affect the avoidant so profoundly. They do not create the conflict, they reveal it. The avoidant may begin noticing things they previously kept buried. They may realize they missed the person. They may remember small moments that seemed insignificant at the time. A conversation, a particular expression, the way that person listened without interrupting, the sense of being understood without having to explain every detail, the absence of judgment, the strange comfort of knowing someone could see through their defenses without trying to control them. These memories can return unexpectedly. Not necessarily because the empath is doing anything to make them return, but because emotional experiences that feel different from the familiar patterns tend to stay with us. And this particular experience carries a contradiction the avoidant may struggle to understand. The person cared deeply, but they did not cling. They were emotionally available, but they were not emotionally dependent. They could recognize the avoidant's fears, but they did not make those fears their identity. They could stay compassionate without staying trapped. That creates a very different kind of emotional imprint. The avoidant may have been accustomed to thinking that closeness always leads to pressure, but here was someone who demonstrated that closeness can coexist with freedom. They may have believed that if someone truly cares, that person will eventually demand more. But here was someone capable of caring without constantly demanding access. They may have believed that being deeply known would eventually lead to criticism. And if this part feels familiar, keep listening, because the next realization is where everything becomes even clearer. The empath's presence does not force the avoidant to change. It simply removes many of the usual distractions that allow them to avoid seeing what is happening inside. When there is no chasing, there is less external noise. When there is no punishment, there is less defensiveness. When there is no idealization, there is no perfect image to hide behind. The avoidant is left with something much more direct, their own emotional response. They may realize that the person they thought would always remain available is continuing with their own life. They may notice that the empath is not waiting for permission to be happy. They may see that the connection mattered, but it was never allowed to become the center of the empath's entire existence. That can create respect. It can also create longing. Sometimes it creates fear, and sometimes all three appear at once. The important point is that the empath does not manipulate any of this. They are not using silence as a trick. They are not calculating how long to disappear. They are not trying to trigger jealousy or create anxiety. They simply refuse to abandon themselves in order to keep another person close. That is why their calmness carries so much weight. It is not coldness. It is not indifference. It is emotional self-respect. And when someone has spent years confusing love with pressure and distance with safety, witnessing this kind of connection can challenge their entire understanding of intimacy. They may slowly begin to understand that closeness can be chosen rather than forced, that vulnerability can happen without losing autonomy.